I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the police. I didn't even call my best friend to cry on the phone. I just said, okay, do whatever you want. And then I hung up. Because my plan was already in place, and my brother had no idea he'd just handed me everything I needed. My name is Clara, and for as long as I can remember, I was the one who held things together. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who stayed late, skipped vacations, and quietly swallowed every inconvenience so that the people around me didn't have to feel uncomfortable. My family had a word for this. They called it being reliable. I called it being invisible. I'm 31 now. I work in commercial real estate, not the glamorous kind you see on television, but the real kind. Lease agreements, zoning applications, tenant negotiations, building inspections. Paperwork that most people find boring and I find deeply satisfying because in this work, details matter. Contracts matter, and if you've done your homework, the truth is always already written down somewhere. You just have to know where to look. I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario, middle of 3 kids, which sounds balanced until you understand the actual math of my family. My older brother, Derek, was the firstborn son. My younger sister, Amber, was the baby. That left me in a position that had no official title, but everyone understood, the one who doesn't need anything, so we won't ask. Derek is 35. He has a comfortable personality, a loud laugh, and a lifelong habit of starting projects he doesn't finish. Over the years, those unfinished projects had a way of becoming other people's problems, specifically mine. I'd paid the deposit on his first apartment when his credit fell through. I co-signed a car loan that he made payments on for exactly 4 months before I quietly started covering them myself so my credit wouldn't collapse. I didn't ask for anything back. That was the agreement, not one anyone said out loud, but one everyone seemed to understand. My parents are good people. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story about bad parents. It's a story about parents who loved their children in unequal amounts without ever admitting it, even to themselves. My mother is warm and generous and completely incapable of saying no to Derek. My father is practical and fair in theory and, in practice, defers to my mother in everything related to the children. The result was a household where Derek's failures were absorbed by the family and my contributions were absorbed by silence. I stopped expecting anything different by the time I was 25. What I didn't stop doing was building. 3 years ago, I found a property in the east end of Guelph, a former photography studio on the ground floor of the mixed-use building, just under 1,200 square feet. The lease terms were reasonable. The location had foot traffic. The bones of the space were excellent: original hardwood floors, high ceilings, north-facing windows that let in clean, even light all day. I had been looking for exactly this kind of space for 2 years. I wanted to open a textile and craft studio, a working space where people could come for weaving, natural dyeing, bookbinding, hand sewing, a creative studio in the old sense of the word, not the Instagram kind. I'd spent years taking workshops across Ontario, building skills and connections and a small but loyal online following. I knew the market. I knew my numbers. I had a business plan that my accountant had reviewed twice and called conservative. I signed the lease in March. I spent the next 14 months doing the build-out myself and with 2 trusted contractors. I applied for every permit required: commercial renovation permit, change of use permit, accessibility compliance review, fire inspection, occupancy permit. In Ontario, particularly for a business welcoming the public, these aren't optional. They take time and money and patience, and I gave all 3 without complaint because I understood something fundamental. The paperwork is the protection. I named the studio Thread and Light. I was 2 weeks from my scheduled soft opening when my brother called. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I was at the studio doing a final walkthrough with my main contractor, a woman named Priya, who had been invaluable throughout the entire project. We were standing in the back workroom reviewing the ventilation installation when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I almost let it go to voicemail. Clara. Derek's voice had a particular quality when he wanted something, a kind of casual warmth that showed up precisely when he needed a favor. I had learned to recognize it the way you learn to recognize the sound of a car engine about to stall. How's the studio coming along? I told him it was coming along well. Good, good. Listen, I've been thinking. I drove past the other day and I got to be honest with you. The location is perfect. Way better than what I'd been looking at. I stood very still. I've been talking to Mom and Dad about it. We think, and I know this might sound like a lot, but hear me out. We think the space would be a better fit for my woodworking business. You know I've been trying to get the workshop going for 2 years now. I need something commercial. And your spot has the square footage, the parking, the visibility. It would actually make a real go of it, Clara, a real business. I asked him what he was suggesting. Just that maybe you consider, look, your craft thing is great, but is it really going to make money, like real money? Dad agrees with me. We think if I took over the lease, converted the space, I could have it up and running by spring. I want to be precise about what happened in my body in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt exactly. It was a cold, focused recognition. I had poured 3 years of savings, roughly $74,000 in total between the deposit, build-out, permits, equipment, and first year's operating reserve into that space. I had done everything correctly. I had done everything alone. And my brother, who had never applied for a business permit in his life, was calling me on a Tuesday night to suggest that I hand it over. I said, "Let me think about it." He said, "Don't think too long. I've already talked to the building manager." I said okay, and I hung up. Priya looked at me from across the workroom. She had heard enough to understand the shape of the conversation. "Don't," I said, before she could say anything. I wasn't going to say anything. Good. I put my phone in my pocket. Let's finish the walkthrough. I need to explain why I didn't simply refuse. The obvious answer, the answer several people asked me about later, is that I could have said no. I could have said, this is my lease, my build-out, my permits, my business, no. And legally, I would have been completely correct. Derek's name was on nothing. He had no claim. But Derek wasn't calling to negotiate. He was calling to notify me. And the fact that he had already talked to the building manager meant one thing. My parents had gotten involved before the phone call. This wasn't a request. This was the family assuming, as they always had, that my careful, quiet work was available for redistribution the moment someone louder needed it. If I said no directly, I would become the obstacle, the difficult one, the daughter who wouldn't help her family. I had watched this happen to other people in similar situations. The moment you resist the family narrative, you become the villain in it. Derek would be hurt. My mother would be tearful. My father would give me a quiet, disappointed look that was somehow worse than an argument, and I would spend the next 5 years defending a decision that should have required no defense at all. I didn't want to fight them. I wanted them to make themselves indefensible. I called my friend Rachel that night. Rachel is a paralegal and the most methodical person I know. I explained the situation in full. She asked a few precise questions and then said, "How much documentation do you have?" I said, "Comprehensive," she said. "Then do nothing yet. Let me look at something." Over the following 4 days, while my family apparently interpreted my silence as wavering, Rachel and I worked through every aspect of the situation. The lease was in my name. The permits were issued to my business registration. The equipment, looms, die vats, storage shelving, the custom-built cutting tables, was all documented in my business records with purchase receipts. The landlord, a property management company based in Cambridge, had my contact information and no one else's. What Rachel found was this. My brother had apparently spoken to one of the building's maintenance staff, not the property manager, not anyone with authority, and had gotten what he interpreted as encouragement. There was no actual conversation with the leasing office. There was no paperwork initiated. There was nothing. There was, however, a family dinner scheduled for that Saturday. I went. The dinner was at my parents' house in Kitchener. My mother had made her good roast chicken, which I recognized as a diplomatic gesture, the meal she makes when she wants everyone to feel settled before a difficult conversation. Amber was there with her boyfriend. Derek arrived 20 minutes late with his girlfriend, Kayla, who smiled at me with an expression I can only describe as preemptive sympathy. We made it through the main course before my father cleared his throat. He said that the family had been discussing the studio. He said that Derek had a real opportunity here and that the timing was good. He said that they wanted to talk about whether there was a way to make this work for everyone. I asked what "make this work for everyone" meant. My mother said that maybe I could find another space, that the east end of Guelph had other options, that it would mean so much to the family if I could be flexible on this. I looked around the table. Amber was looking at her plate. Kayla was looking at Derek. Derek was looking at me with an expression of complete, uncomplicated confidence. the look of a person who has never once doubted that the world would arrange itself to his convenience. I said, "I'll think about it." My mother smiled. My father nodded. Derek said, "I knew you'd come around." I drove home and called Rachel and said, "Phase 2. I want to explain what I actually did, because I've had people ask me since whether it was calculated or whether I just got lucky. It was not luck. What I did was nothing. Strategically, precisely, nothing. I did not respond to the family's expectation. I did not accelerate my soft opening. I did not warn the building management company that my family might be in contact. I did not change any of my plans in any direction. What I did do, I contacted my insurance broker and reviewed my tenant liability policy. I updated my business registration to include the full legal description of the premises. I had PREA complete and signed off on a written statement documenting the full scope of the completed renovation work and its compliance with municipal permit requirements. And I made sure that every piece of equipment in the studio was photographed, logged, and tied to a purchase receipt, filed under my business name. Then I kept my phone on and waited. 3 weeks later, the week I had originally planned for my soft opening, I was in Hamilton visiting a supplier when my phone started. First Kayla, then my mother, then Derek, 4 times in a row. I let them go to voicemail. Amber texted me, "Clara, please call someone. Derek is at the studio. I think things got out of hand." I sat in my car in the supplier's parking lot and listened to the voicemails in order. Derek's first message was triumphant. He said the building manager had let him do a walkthrough and that the space was even better than he remembered, and he was going to start clearing it out this weekend. His second message was less certain. He said one of the contractors he'd brought along had told him something about the ceiling supports that apparently mattered for a renovation. His third message, "Clara, call me back." His fourth message had my mother in the background and the sound of something mechanical in the foreground that I could not immediately identify. Derek's voice was different. The casual warmth was completely gone. "There are people here. Official people. You need to come." I drove to Guelph. What had happened was this. Derek had gone to the studio that morning with 2 friends who did renovation work and his girlfriend with the apparent intention of beginning to remove my equipment so he could assess the space. He had, at some point in the previous week, convinced himself or been convinced that my silence meant consent. Or perhaps he had simply decided it didn't matter. The building management company had not authorized this. The leasing office, when they found out, had contacted the city of Guelph by law enforcement because an unauthorized individual was accessing a commercial tenant's leased premises. When bylaw arrived, they found Derek's friends attempting to move one of my large floor looms, equipment I had registered as a business asset, and discovered that Derek had no documentation, no lease assignment, no written permission from me, no work permit, nothing. They also found that Derek's friend had, in an early act of confidence, removed a section of drywall near the back of the space. The wall they'd chosen happened to be adjacent to the building's main mechanical room. This didn't require a structural engineer to identify as a problem. The bylaw officer noted it immediately and placed a stop work order. When I arrived, Derek was standing outside on the sidewalk. He looked like someone who had been very certain of something 20 minutes ago and was now reconstructing his understanding of reality in real time. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me the permits and everything were in your name?" I said, "You didn't ask." He said, "You didn't ask." He said, "This isn't how family is supposed to work." I looked at him for a moment. 3 years of savings, 14 months of build-out. Every permit, every inspection, every careful, quiet, solitary step of building something from nothing. And the question, delivered with complete sincerity, was why I hadn't made it easier for him to take it away. I said, "Derek, this is exactly how it works." I went inside to speak with the bylaw officer. The stop work order meant the unauthorized activity was formally documented. The building management company, now aware that Derek had accessed the space without authorization, issued a formal notice that he was barred from the property. The friends he'd brought were interviewed and confirmed they'd been told by Derek that he was taking over the space from his sister and that she had agreed. That last part created a secondary issue that I had not anticipated, and that, in retrospect, was the detail that made everything else irrelevant. Because Derek had represented to those individuals that I had agreed to the transfer, and because one of them had actually moved my equipment in reliance on that representation, my lawyer, I had called one by this point, sent a letter to Derek documenting the misrepresentation and the resulting civil exposure. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a letter. But it was the kind of letter that describes, in measured and specific language, what a lawsuit would look like. My parents received a copy. I didn't send it. My lawyer addressed it to Derek and his last known address, which was still my parents' house. My mother called me the same evening. I expected crying. I expected accusations. I expected to be told I was tearing the family apart. Instead, her voice was very quiet. She said, "We didn't know he told people you'd agreed." I said, "I know." She said, "He asked us to cover the legal letter in case it went further." I said, "That's between you and Derek." She said, "Clara." I said, "Mom, I'm going to open my studio. I'd like you to come to the opening, but I'm going to open it." There was a long pause. She said, "Okay." Thread and Light had its soft opening on a Friday in early December. The north-facing windows were exactly what I had imagined. The winter light came in flat and clean, and the natural-dyed textiles I'd hung on the back wall looked extraordinary in it. Priya came. Rachel came. Several people I knew from the Ontario craft community came. People I had met over years of workshops and markets who understood what this space represented. I didn't invite my family. Not for the soft opening. I invited them to the proper opening in January. All of them, including Derek. I wanted them to see it finished. I wanted them to understand, in person, what the thing they had tried to take actually was. Derek came. He stood near the entrance for most of the evening and didn't say much. At one point he walked to the back workroom where the large floor looms were set up, the same loom his friend had started moving on the day everything fell apart, and stood looking at it for a long moment. I walked over and stood beside him. He said, "It's a good space." I said, "Yes, it is." He didn't say he was sorry. I didn't expect him to. What I understood, watching him stand there looking at the thing he had tried to take and couldn't, was that the lesson wasn't for him. It had never been for him. It was for me, the confirmation, finally and clearly, that what I'd built was mine. That careful work and correct documentation and the boring, unglamorous patience of doing things properly was not a weakness. It was the only strategy that had ever actually worked. My brother didn't take my studio. Not because I fought him, not because I made a scene or threatened him at the dinner table or called a lawyer the night he first called me. He didn't take it because there was nothing to take. Everything was already correctly mine. When people ask me how I handled it, I tell them this: don't block the wave. Let it come. If you've built on solid ground, it will break around you and pull back without you having moved an inch. The studio is doing well. We're fully booked for workshops through the spring. Priya's daughter joined us as an apprentice in February, which made Priya cry in a way that I found unexpectedly moving. My mother comes in sometimes on Saturday mornings. She's learning to weave. She's not very good yet, but she shows up every week, and she's getting better. That, I think, is its own kind of answer.